Welcome back to our Journey to Eden. I am Shaylin Fair. I have for you the next episode on the extrovert temperament. So we are unpacking, me and John Sparks, unpacking the strengths, weaknesses, and tools to handle your sanguine extrovert temperament, whether it's within yourself or in a relationship, if you need to understand your partner or your child or a work colleague. These are just such insightful, helpful conversations all about temperaments. I am a massive melancholic temperament with a little bit of the sanguine, and that's why I've chosen to do the sanguine first. Next episode will be about the choleric extrovert. So wait for that in the next couple of weeks. It'll be out for you. If you follow my Instagram and Patreon, I'll be putting up my release schedule on there for you guys. So enjoy this episode. And I do want to let you know as well that I'm dedicating all this understanding your temperament to John Sparks, who you will hear in all these episodes. John Sparks was a friend and a counselor to me. He was a counselor for up to 50 years. He counseled people for free. He never charged a cent. He was such an amazing man and set such a good example for me in my own life. And I want to carry on that legacy and those wonderful tools that he gave me. I want to carry them to you to help you on your journey. So John Sparks did pass away last year from his battle with cancer. And we do actually do an episode on whether we have faith or is it wishful thinking to be healed from some challenging diseases that we may face in this life. And that was a really hard hitting and very helpful episode. So if you are struggling with health, with wishful thinking or faith, please go listen to that episode. And I hope it encourages you as well in your journey. So without further ado, enjoy this conversation about the sanguine temperament with beloved John Sparks and I. To help you understand yourself, restore your desert places, and discover the beautiful path. This is our Journey to Eden podcast. So, John, why is it important to gain an understanding of your temperament? And what difference does it make to somebody's life if they put the effort in to actually know yourself at this level?
Well, I think most of us at some point or other, unless you've been one of those very fortunate people that's been spared this, most of us will have probably wondered what on earth is wrong with us. All sorts of strange feelings going on inside, and sometimes very contradictory feelings. And one of the things we've been saying very clearly in these interviews is that there is at least two parts to each of us, very distinct parts that we're calling our temperaments. And so when you've got a set of emotions or two sets of emotions, both contradicting each other, you can really wonder what on earth is going on inside you. You can feel almost like a split personality or as if you're being very indecisive at times. Because there are just two completely seemingly irreconcilable sets of emotions happening at the same time. So to make sense of all this can bring an enormous amount of peace and of deep self-acceptance.
So before we actually unpack the two extrovert temperaments, is there a real-life example of maybe somebody who you've helped on this journey of understanding their temperaments, how they were before and how they started to manage themselves with this information afterwards?
Yes, I'm thinking of a lady who came to us many, many years ago. She has the choleric temperament that we'll be discussing a little later on in this interview. And she has the melancholic temperament that we discussed in our last interview. Now, she used to live her life almost exclusively in the choleric. And by that I mean, as we will discover, the choleric is quite outgoing, quite focused, quite functional, project-orientated. But the problem is that the introvert, the melancholic, is quite opposite to that. Very reflective, sensitive, and unfortunately her melancholic was really in a big muddle. And it was what she called the dark side of her. And she would even have nightmares in which she would wake up in the night with this sense of something dark and foreboding chasing her and trying to engulf her. And as we talked, it became clear that it was actually her own melancholic temperament that was so full of fear that it was something to run away from. Now, today, this lady sees it all completely differently and actually recognizes the enormous qualities that are there in the melancholic, the creativity and everything that we discussed last time, and is enjoying experiencing the depth of what and who she really is. So instead of being scared of herself and being pushed up into that extrovert so that the whole of life was having to be lived at a fairly frenetic pace, she could actually be both. She could do the projects and gain great satisfaction from them, but she could also be still and recognize her ability to deeply feel things and appreciate life and appreciate what's around her and relationships. So that would be a very clear example of somebody turning from fear to a deep acceptance of herself.
That's really beautiful. And it's just amazing, gaining this understanding of yourself at that level can really free you up in your life.
Yes.
So if we start to unpack the two extrovert temperaments, shall we start with the sanguine? I'm going to say the sanguine because I'm the sanguine. So we'll start with that first.
Yes.
So we start off with let's go with the negatives and then go into the positives of the sanguine temperament.
Do you really want to start with the negatives?
Yes, because I think then we can at least end on the positives.
Okay, sounds good. Good. Okay, then. Well, let's try and convey the feel first, and then it will help make sense of some of the specifics. The sanguine actually can feel superficial. I always remember the little story of this young lady who had to have music on all the time. She had her headphones in. She couldn't allow herself any time in the day when she stopped listening to this music. And somebody challenged her on this and said, why don't you just give yourself a break and have some peace and quiet? And basically she said, if I shut the music out, she said, I would start to think. And if I started to think, I don't know what I would do with my thoughts and my feelings. And she even went so far as to say, this young lady did, that she would have to seriously think of taking her own life if she really got in touch with what she was feeling. Now, okay, that's a bit of an extreme example. And I'm certainly not saying all sanguines are like that. But that tendency to sort of skate across the surface, that is there. And they're kind of afraid of their own, a fear of their own superficiality. Now, that is not me saying they're superficial, but that's kind of what they feel about themselves. So you can immediately feel how important it is that they link up with their introvert so that they realize that there is something really solid beneath their feet. Now, because of that sort of basic feeling of being rather like a babbling brook, they can be very undisciplined. They can set off to do a task and then they can get distracted and have difficulty perhaps finishing it. This is the negative side when self is at the center. So you do understand that I'm not saying sanguines are like this all the time. They're certainly not. It can be very loud. That can be a good thing. If it's all very quiet at the meal table and all you hear is people slurping their soup, to have a loud sanguine present can be a good thing. But
I was often asked to tone it down and to be a little bit quieter, so I can relate to that one a lot.
Yes, that's right. And they can also be very egocentric. And that's quite an important one. They have to be at the centre, and they don't know how to cope. I'll tell a little story I sometimes tell on the courses. And one of my daughters came back from school and talked about this little lady. And this would have been, I think, at middle school, so they would have been youngsters. And this girl, as a good sanguine, had her own circle of friends, and they all were loyal servants to this little sanguine girl and tended to her every emotional whim, until one day a new girl turned up at school. And she was equally as strong a sanguine, and very quickly managed to draw away some of the original little girls. Her name was Sarah, the first girl, some of her little friends. And this girl created her own circle with some of Sarah's former circle. And of course, this didn't go down well with Sarah at all. So how did Sarah handle this? Well, what she did is went to the other side of the playground and stood with her back to everybody and piped her eyes, but making sure she peeped over her shoulder every now and again to see how her former friends were going to respond to this outburst of tearful emotion. And gradually the ploy began to work, and she saw her former friends begin to drift back and reform as a circle around here. And she'd basically been able to emotionally manipulate them so that she could be back at the center of her circle and all was well. Now, okay, we can laugh at that in childhood, but I've seen that work out in situations where you've got an adult doing that kind of behavior, and it can be very disruptive and divisive and damaging. And so that need to be at the center, and the feeling is I'm not worth anything unless I'm at the center. So for the sanguine to know their own value and have the kind of depth that we've been talking about by being in touch with their introvert, it removes that powerful need to always be at the center. That's a powerful part of the sanguine. We've already touched on how they can be fearful. They actually don't like pain. There are some similarities between the sanguine and the phlegmatic. They don't like it if something unpleasant is happening or even being said about somebody. I knew a sanguine who said, well, if you haven't got anything good to say about the person, don't say anything at all. Now, that sounds very noble, but actually it was a euphemism for I don't really want to look at reality. So that's a sanguine. They can be weak-willed, put them under pressure, and they can wilt. They can be restless. We've touched on that kind of thing a sanguine child might do. Well, let's put it positively. So if you have a sanguine child and they've got the playthings out for that morning's play, mum perhaps has set everything up and the child is meant to settle down to at least 20 minutes, half an hour playing with those particular toys, you may find after about 20 seconds that the child is tired of those particular playthings, stands up, probably scrunches some of the toys in the process on the way to getting some more things off the shelf so she can get something else out. Now, what a parent has to do there, slow the child down, help their length of concentration, make sure the stuff is cleared away before anything else is got out. Otherwise, you're constantly being controlled by that ceaseless restlessness. And that's something that the child needs to learn early on in life.
And have you seen how restlessness maybe plays out in adults?
Yes.
Sanguine?
Yes, very much so. I always remember a Christian lady actually saying to me something like, I really feel that God wants me to go around the world, a kind of tour around the world. Now, she'd kind of already done that once. And when she said this a second time, she'd done it before I knew her. But when she said that a second time, you just knew instinctively this was not the Lord saying, I want you to do that. This was this lady's restlessness. She just couldn't stay in one place for any length of time. And that would be a very good example. Fortunately, she did listen, so she saved herself a lot of money. But she also had to, face things and work through things rather than taking the escape route. Sometimes I think of a sanguine as like the Wi-Fi signal. It's a series of waves, isn't it, going further and further out. And that ties in with the next attribute that I want to mention. It's a bit of a negative. They can be an exaggerator. So everything expands, the classic of I caught a fish and it may have been a foot long, but by the time the story's been told 3 or 4 times, it's grown into 3 feet long. And their reality can expand because that's the kind of person that they are. They're very outgoing. And as we'll see in a moment, they're very enthusiastic, and warm and all the other lovely things we should talk about. But with that comes that kind of expansive version of life. So when that's pushed too far, they can actually be saying things that simply aren't true, but because it feels true to them, they actually believe their own lies. I always remember my dad working with a man who ran a furniture and removal business. And sometimes customers would phone up and say, well, where is my piece of furniture? Or why hasn't it arrived? And this chap would be saying to them, my dad would overhear this, he'd say, it's already loaded on the van. We'll have it to you in no time, and all the rest. Well, the truth was the item of furniture hadn't even come into the shop. But what my dad said, interestingly enough, was that he actually thought that this man really did believe his own lies. So, they have to make sure, and you have to teach the sanguine to live in reality. They can be bossy, and they can be unreliable. That's a pretty negative picture, isn't it? But that's when self is at the centre.
Yes, let's quickly move on to the positives.
Yes, let's do that, because the truth of it is that actually the sanguine can be one of the loveliest temperaments. They've got so much going for them. And as we've been saying, if the person is secure, and we would say as Christians, if Jesus is at the centre, you're going to get the very, very best of this lovely temperament. So they can be compassionate. They've got big hearts. They'll be really, really kind, even to their own detriment. Very friendly. They're the kind of people that, let's say you visit them in their home. You don't have to sort of be on parade or anything. You really can relax with them. They just make you feel comfortable. They're very hospitable, those kind of people. You don't feel you're in the way. They're very personable. And they seem to really take an interest in you and engage with you. They're just really lovely people. They can be talkative, but I've put that in as a positive because, as we said earlier, if everybody sits there in silence, it can be awkward and embarrassing, but you can rely on a sanguine to come up with a good story, and to be the centre, and really to keep everybody engaged. And there are circumstances where that's a lovely quality to have. As we've already said, they can be outgoing and engaging, and they can be carefree. They can be enthusiastic. They're the kind of people that may well go from one interest to another, but whatever they engage with at the time, they will be so enthusiastic, they'll draw other people into it, and they're just lovely people. They can be very warm, and you do really feel that they've got a heart for you. And we've touched on the fact they can be compassionate, but another side of that is they can be very generous. And, they would give to you on every level, even if it disadvantaged them. So they're very warm, lovely personalities. They're great fun. They'll nearly always have a really good sense of humour. And it might be worth me saying this. It's not because I want to put a negative in, but if you've got a person who's a sanguine, whichever temperament they've got underneath, especially if it's a phlegmatic, the sanguine is so lovely that actually they can almost get away with just living in their sanguine. Now that isn't how to live, but they can still be lovely people, very well thought of, even make something of their life, and they can switch off the phlegmatic. Now, that's not a good thing to do, and it will, over time, have serious consequences. But they're so good that they can carry it, and they'll often not feel the need to open up whichever introvert temperament they've got that they're carrying inside. It's much harder to switch the melancholic off, but what they can do is cover what they're feeling by all those lovely positive traits that they carry in the sanguine. So, for example, some of our greatest comedians were sanguine-melancholics. And you've heard stories, haven't you, of how when they're on the stage, they absolutely come alive because they've got all the creativity and talent in the melancholic, and then they've got the sanguine with that lovely personality and ability to articulate. So, they can put on the most amazing, hilarious show. And as soon as the lights go out, they'll stagger off stage and go and prop the bar up. And within minutes, be in the depths of depression. And they've just spent the last hour having everybody in stitches of laughter. That's kind of not an exaggeration. And there's a real pattern there. And that's where you would see those two temperaments at work. So the sanguine is absolutely lovely, but it is so important that they learn to look at their introvert and put the hard work into understanding and handling their introvert to make it work in conjunction with the sanguine in this case, so that the person is whole and, as we said right at the beginning, joined up on the inside.
So when you say, getting them the sanguine to work with the melancholic, in practice, what does that actually look like or feel like? I'm a sanguine melancholic, and so what pointers would you give to me, or how could that be fleshed out?
Okay, it's a good question. I think this is about, and there's kind of a different answer for each of the temperament combinations, if that makes sense. But specifically for the sanguine melancholic, I think it's about getting to know both as if they're two, because they are two separate people. So value your sanguine and live in it and enjoy it, but equally value and accept your melancholic. So to use the illustration, that we've just used of the comedian, if a person feels themselves being drawn into depression, then take that seriously in the sense of, well, why am I feeling like this? And what is really going on? Because if you think about it, if you take any set of circumstances and you put two different people in that same set of circumstances, one will respond in one way and the other will respond in another. So in the case we're discussing here, the sanguine is going to respond to, say, difficult circumstances by being expansive and expressive and perhaps making a lot of noise and being at the center. But the melancholic might be scared silly. The melancholic might be deeply affected by the negatives that are in the circumstances and will react utterly and completely differently to the things, the way that the extrovert, the sanguine, is reacting. So you can see why I said right at the beginning, you can have somebody feeling two completely opposite sets of emotions at exactly the same time. So the answer is quite consciously accept that you've got the lovely sanguine temperament, but you've also got the melancholic temperament, which has such a depth, such a sensitivity, a creativity, but equally value it. But you will have to work harder at it because the emotions go on at such a depth and in such a way that the sanguine herself will not actually recognize what's going on. So the melancholic has to take responsibility for who she is in the same way that the sanguine has to take responsibility for who she is. It's take yourself seriously. I don't mean in a heavy way, but especially take the melancholic seriously and make a friend of it, if you like, and get it to work for you, not against you.
I think what all this kind of content and information and understanding has provided me is just a deeper awareness of how complex and wonderful we actually are,
Yes.
with all our thoughts and feelings, and, how most of us do have those two temperaments and they can have opposing characteristics. Yes. So is there a ratio, well, I know there is, but maybe you could go into this and how it affects us, but the ratio of how big is your melancholic compared to the sanguine? How big is your extrovert compared to your introvert? Because I know when I did the course with you, it came out that I was 70% melancholic, and that just came out through a series of, the questionnaires and conversation. Yes. 70% melancholic, and then the smaller part of me was sanguine. Yes. And when that information was in front of me, it just made so much sense. For me, I just understood myself with so much more light and understanding, and yes, it helped me. Yeah, so just look back at my life and realize, that's why I was always exhausted after school, completely drained, because I was always pushing myself into the class clown sanguine.
Yes.
Being loud constantly. Yes. And I was never, going into my quiet kind of melancholic. But I do remember when I was in art class, it was always my best class and always got my best marks, because that's when I did allow myself to be, quiet and creative. Yeah. But just, so going back to the question of how do you kind of know, or
in a way, you've answered the question yourself, and very well. It's exactly as you've said. It's hard work living in the part of you that perhaps doesn't naturally dominate, because that draws out another important principle here. If we don't understand our introvert and are not in the process of learning how to handle it, we will automatically try and escape into the extrovert. And not only are we neglecting all the qualities in the introvert, but we're putting a double load onto the extrovert. And as you rightly say, if perhaps you're only 30% sanguine, that means that that part of you is carrying 100% responsibility for the whole of who you are. So that's why you would be exhausted. But really, the understanding that you've just shown really does set you free, because I know you well enough to know that you are predominantly a creative person. In other words, your melancholic comes through loud and clear. So you are much more living in the balance of who you are that is consistent with the fact you're 70% melancholic and 30% sanguine.
Is there a way for people to kind of determine, which temperament they have is bigger? Or is it always the introvert which has more weight?
No, it's not always. It could have been the other way around. You could have been 70% sanguine and 30% melancholic. We do a what we call a temperament checklist that just asks a series of questions relating to the temperament traits. So if anybody was interested in just doing that, and then you ask somebody else to fill in a column for you, that's quite interesting. Do just write into the website and ask for that, and we'll gladly do that for you. But that aside, I think the more you familiarize yourself with the various traits, it is a case of kind of getting to know yourself, and that doesn't happen overnight. But if you look at the traits, you'll find some of them there on the website and in one of our little booklets that we've mentioned, Understanding Temperaments, or on Amazon, Understanding Yourself. If you look at that, you'll begin to recognize those traits within yourself, and you begin to think, okay, so that's my melancholic. And that's all right. Cultivate it, celebrate it. And equally, those lovely qualities of the sanguine, don't stifle them. Be both, do both. Just gives you an incredible range of qualities at your fingertips.
Yeah, and then as well as just making yourself aware of where you could have weaknesses. So if one thing I've had to deal with is restlessness, and in some cases been pretty extreme, waking up just feeling very restless even before the day begun. And it's just been so helpful to know that, that's just part of my temperament, and it doesn't make me good or bad, but it's what do I want to do with that restlessness?
Yes.
And different ways to handle that. You can point that restlessness as something positive and constructive, just to kind of settle it down. But it's all very powerful information, and I would highly recommend people to go on that journey to understand, who they are.
Yes.
So
sorry, Shaylin, could I interrupt, because I've got a little illustration that may well help see this the other way around with the sanguine melancholic.
Yes.
I have a friend who he was pretty stressed out at a period of time in his life. Suffered a lot of internal pressure, shall we say. And he reached a point where he realized that he needed, as a sanguine melancholic, to be much kinder to his melancholic, to give it space. He was a very physical lad. He loved mountain biking and surfing and all sorts of outgoing stuff. But he realized he was neglecting his melancholic, and that was giving him some real problems. And as a fill-in job, he worked at a fruit farm in the farm shop, and the owner asked him to run a market stall, I think a couple of days a week or something like that. And I remember him telling me about one day, and he was feeling under quite a bit of pressure from all sorts of stuff, but he had a really good day on this market stall, or a good morning. And then he came to dinner time, and he realized he was churning away on the inside. And the way he put it to me was, he said, I hadn't given any space to my melancholic at all during the day. And what he did was close the market stall just for a short time, could have been as short as half an hour, went and sat on a park bench somewhere. And he said, all I was doing was just giving my melancholic some space so I could get in touch with what I felt be comfortable in myself again. And I went back to the stall and had a really good afternoon. And he's learned to take his melancholic seriously, and he's come through some really difficult times, but come out strong because he took both parts of who he is very seriously.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. And it's that real idea of slowing down enough to allow yourself to feel.
Yes.
Thank you for being here on our journey to Eden. If you enjoyed that episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Remember, you can check out all the links in the description below or on the podcast description, wherever you're listening. And you can come support me over on Patreon, as well as if you would like to stay tuned, next year I'll be bringing to you products. I'm very excited about a book that I'm writing, which is going to surprise you, and I think it's going to be absolutely beautiful and helpful to so many people. So stay tuned and keep coming back as we journey together.